She had the kind of face that made people remember her, a thoughtful stare, eyes always a bit distant, as if scanning something just beyond the horizon. Leah Roberts was 23 when she vanished, and though more than 2 decades have passed since that cold morning in March 2000, her name still echoes in hushed tones across the Pacific Northwest. Her story isn't one of obvious tragedy or immediate chaos. It's a story that slinks quietly through the trees, full of loose ends and maddening silences, the kind that refuses to fade. What makes Leah's disappearance so haunting isn't just that she's gone, but the mystery she left behind, a puzzle with pieces scattered over miles and memories, and a trail that ends abruptly in the dense woods of Washington state. Born in 1976, Leah grew up in Durham, North Carolina. Her childhood seemed idyllic to the outside world. The youngest of 3 siblings, she had a bright spirit, full of warmth, creativity, and an artistic sensibility that never dimmed. She played soccer, learned music, and developed a deep appreciation for literature, particularly the works of Jack Kerouac. Her life took a darker turn during her college years at North Carolina State University, where she was studying Spanish and anthropology. A series of devastating personal events unraveled Leah's world in a short span of time. Her father died of a chronic illness in 1996. Just a few years later, her mother was diagnosed with, and quickly succumbed to, heart disease. Then, as if fate hadn't yet delivered its final blow, Leah was involved in a near-fatal car accident. It broke her femur and punctured her lung, and left her with metal rods in her leg and a long, painful recovery. But it also changed her perspective on life entirely. After the accident, Leah no longer saw life as a linear path. Her siblings, particularly her older sister Cara and brother Heath, noticed that she had begun talking about things differently. She started to speak more frequently of fate, of living in the moment, of destiny. She seemed to detach from the traditional plans she once had, like finishing her degree or settling down. Instead, she seemed drawn to something intangible, chasing an idea she couldn't quite explain. She became enamored with the writings of the Beat generation, especially Kerouac's On the Road. It wasn't escapism, not exactly. It was more like a pilgrimage, an urge to find meaning through movement. In March 2000, Leah's behaviour changed in ways that at first seemed curious but not alarming. She withdrew several $1,000s from her bank account. She began giving away some of her belongings. Then one morning she disappeared. No one knew where she'd gone, not her roommates, not her siblings. She left behind a note, but it wasn't a goodbye. It was more philosophical, referencing her need to seek something deeper, inspired by Kerouac's journeys. She left with her cat, her white '93 Jeep Cherokee, some clothes, and a collection of her favourite books. The note she left behind read like a manifesto of self-discovery. It made clear she wasn't running from something, but perhaps running towards something she couldn't yet name. At first, Leah's family wasn't panicked. She had always been independent, thoughtful, a bit of a dreamer. But days passed with no contact. Then a week, then 2. Her bank account showed sporadic activity. A motel stay here, a gas purchase there. All of it was westward bound, a trail of breadcrumbs stretching across the country. Her siblings began to trace her steps. They learned she had stopped at a coffee shop in Memphis. She'd chatted with a clerk in Utah. She'd bought gas in Oregon. It became clear she was traveling toward Washington's estate and toward a place she had always dreamed of visiting, the Cascade Mountains, near Bellingham. And then the trail stopped. On March 18, 2000, her Jeep was discovered wrecked in a remote area near Bellingham, at the end of a rugged logging road off Mount Baker Highway. The vehicle had been severely damaged, apparently rolled off an embankment, yet inside, investigators found oddities that didn't align with a fatal crash. Blankets had been hung over the windows, as if someone had been camping in the vehicle. Her belongings, including clothes, cash, her guitar and her cat's carrier, were still inside. There were no signs of blood, no signs of a struggle, no signs of Leah. A pair of pants was neatly folded on the seat. A fingerprint, unidentified, was found on the rear window, and most curiously under the hood a wire had been cut, an action that would have disabled the vehicle's ability to restart after the crash. Investigators weren't sure whether the crash had been staged or if someone else had been involved. A jogger had reported the wrecked Jeep days before it was actually found, leading to questions about how long the vehicle had really been there and why it hadn't been more thoroughly investigated initially. The discovery only deepened the mystery. What had happened to Leah? Had she crashed the car herself and wandered off into the woods? Was she picked up by a stranger? Did she stage the crash herself as part of some grand disappearance? Or had something more sinister occurred? Her family, especially Cara, flew to Washington immediately. They walked the woods, posted flyers, spoke to locals. They appeared on the news pleading for help, but no one came forward with credible information, and no trace of Leah was ever found. Not a scrap of clothing, not a footprint, not a witness who could say for sure they'd seen her after March 13th. What remained was a ghost of a journey, fragments of movement, and a vanishing that defied logic. Leah had disappeared without a trace in one of the most remote and quietly beautiful corners of the country. And as days turned to years and years turned into decades, her case became one of the most haunting cold cases in the Pacific Northwest. Because it wasn't just that she was missing, it was that in some strange way, she had almost seemed to intend it. But what really happened on that mountain road in 2000? Who was the last person to see Leah Roberts alive? And did her love of Kerouac and spontaneous travel mask something far darker? A vulnerability? A danger she couldn't see coming? These questions have lingered like fog on the trees around Mount Baker. And as we peel back the layers of Leah's story, it becomes clear. The answers may still be out there, buried under the silence she left behind. The forest surrounding Mount Baker doesn't easily give up its secrets. It stretches vast and unbroken in many places, a dense cloak of evergreens and winding trails that seem to swallow sound. The spot where Leah's Jeep was discovered sat off Canyon Creek Road, a narrow path deep in the woods, roughly 30 miles east of Bellingham. The area is isolated, the kind of place you don't find by accident. And yet, there her vehicle was, partially hidden from view, crumpled at the bottom of an embankment, and shrouded in more questions than answers. When investigators arrived at the scene on March 18, 2000, 9 days after her last known whereabouts, they were immediately struck by the oddities. If Leah had crashed there by mistake, why was there no blood, no obvious injury, no effort to call for help? Her belongings, everything she had taken on the trip, were mostly intact, though scattered. Among them were clothes, books, a passport, cash, her cat's belongings, and other personal items. If she had survived the crash, why wouldn't she take essentials with her? If she hadn't, why wasn't her body nearby? Then there was the question of the crash itself. According to a reconstruction of the scene, her Jeep had hit a small embankment at high speed and gone airborne before landing hard in a ravine, but the lack of skid marks suggested no attempt had been made to stop the vehicle. And then there was the wire, snipped deliberately under the hood. Mechanics later confirmed that it would have rendered the Jeep inoperable immediately after impact. Someone had wanted it to stay there, right where it was found. Law enforcement floated several theories. Maybe Leah, in a moment of mental distress or disorientation, crashed and wandered into the wilderness. Or perhaps she had planned the crash, meant to disappear into a new life. Or the darkest possibility, someone else had been with her. Someone who knew how to make it all look like an accident. The Whatcom County Sheriff's Office took the lead, but even early on, their investigation was hampered by the sheer lack of physical evidence. No surveillance footage caught her in the area. No phone calls, no credit card use, no confirmed sightings after March 13th. Her last known purchase had been in Brooks, Oregon, nearly 300 miles south. After that, silence. Her siblings, particularly Cara and Heath, refused to accept that she had simply walked away. They knew Leah. Yes, she had changed after the accident and the deaths of their parents. Yes, she had embraced a freer, more spiritual outlook on life. But she wasn't reckless, and she was close to them. If she were seeking solitude or time to think, she would have said so. She would have called. She would have come back. They hired private investigators, combed the area themselves, and retraced Leah's last known steps. It was Cara who learned of an unsettling detail. A man who had approached a mechanic in Bellingham days after the crash was reported. He'd asked questions about how long a car could remain hidden in the forest before being discovered. The mechanic found this strange, especially once news of Leah's disappearance became public. A sketch was developed from the description of the man, but he was never identified. Even more troubling were the signs that Leah may not have been alone in the Jeep. In the weeks following the discovery, police released information about the fingerprints found on the vehicle, none of which matched Leah, her family, or anyone known to be connected to her. A blanket had been pinned over a window inside, like someone had tried to create privacy. Was this done by Leah or someone else? investigators tried to determine if she could have met someone on the road, perhaps a fellow traveller or someone she had trusted along the way. A waitress in Oregon recalled serving a young woman matching Leah's description who was travelling alone. She said Leah had been friendly but quiet. She seemed reflective, thoughtful, not fearful or anxious. And yet, just a few days later, her Jeep would be found totaled in one of the most inaccessible areas in Washington state. There were hints of a more personal reason for her journey. Leah had often spoken of wanting to visit Kerouac's retreat near Desolation Peak, a mountain in the North Cascades where the author had spent time writing and reflecting. It was a remote pilgrimage site for some literary enthusiasts. Beautiful, tranquil, but notoriously difficult to reach. Could Leah have intended to make her way there? Could she have tried to hike into the wilderness? If she had, there were no signs, no backpack missing, no hiking gear taken from the car. No indication she had been prepared for such a treacherous trip. And the route from where her Jeep was found to Desolation Peak would have taken her far deeper into the mountains, requiring a level of planning and physical endurance that didn't align with what investigators found. Still, her love for Kerouac and the ethos of the open road seemed central to her journey. In one of her last conversations with a friend, she had mentioned that she was trying to find meaning again, something that made her feel connected to her parents, to the fragility of life she had experienced since the accident. Some friends described her as enlightened in the weeks before she left. Others noticed something else, a flicker of sadness behind her eyes, as though she was searching for something she couldn't define. By April, the initial search effort had dwindled. A few aerial sweeps had been conducted, some bloodhounds brought in, but no trace of Leah had been found. The terrain, thick with brush and crisscrossed by dozens of unmarked trails, made it nearly impossible to canvass thoroughly. Volunteers began to fade away, the media shifted focus, and Leah became part of a quieter list, those who vanish without answers, the ones whose stories are too complicated for simple headlines. Her siblings never stopped looking. They kept her name in the news, held candlelight vigils, spoke to anyone who would listen, and behind every effort was the same chilling truth. Leah hadn't just disappeared. She had dissolved into a mystery so carefully knotted that it felt almost orchestrated, either by her own hand or by someone who knew exactly how to make a person disappear. One theory grew louder in the vacuum of evidence, that Leah had accepted a ride from someone, perhaps someone who had gained her trust during her trip, someone who may have offered companionship or even a shared dream of the open road. But if that was true, why was there no witness, no tip, no proof? Unless, of course, that person never intended to let her be found. There's something about the road, the open, winding promise of it, that can be both freeing and treacherous. Leah Roberts had believed in its beauty, in its transformative power. She saw travel not just as movement, but as a kind of spiritual clarity, a means of burning away the fog that had settled over her life since her accident and the deaths of her parents. For Leah, this journey westward wasn't an escape, it was a pilgrimage. But something happened between that intention and the wreckage off Canyon Creek Road. Something that stripped away all trace of her, leaving behind only questions. As spring crept in and the snows around Mount Baker began to melt, searchers held on to hope that maybe, just maybe, the thaw might reveal something. An article of clothing, a footprint, a sign that Leah had survived the crash and wandered into the forest. But the melt revealed nothing. No human remains, no gear, no evidence that anyone had moved through the woods after the Jeep had come to rest there. Leah's family clung to the idea that perhaps she had walked away and chosen to start over. Maybe she didn't want to be found. But that theory always faltered under scrutiny. Leah had left behind nearly everything she would have needed to disappear deliberately. Her identification, her money, her personal effects. She had made no attempt to withdraw more funds, and there was no evidence of new aliases, social security activity, or job applications anywhere in the country. The kinds of breadcrumbs most people leave behind, even unknowingly, simply weren't there. And then there were the small, eerie inconsistencies that refused to settle. A pair of Leah's pants had been neatly folded and placed on the Jeep's front seat, an oddly domestic act in the middle of a supposedly panicked situation. A fingerprint found on the back window still didn't match any in the national database, nor did a partial palm print discovered on the hood. Police were tight-lipped about both. It was possible that the prints were harmless, left behind by a good Samaritan or a mechanic, but it was equally possible they belonged to someone who knew exactly what had happened to Leah, and why no one had heard from her again. More leads came in over time, but most faded into dead ends. A woman matching Leah's description was spotted in a Bellingham diner days after the Jeep was found. But by the time police arrived, the woman was gone. Another tipster claimed to have seen a girl with similar features working at a bookstore in Canada, just over the border, but surveillance footage didn't match. As months turned into a year, then two, the trail cooled to a whisper. The investigators rotated out. New cases took priority, but for Leah's siblings, time didn't erode urgency, it sharpened it. Cara and Heath began to focus on something that had nagged at them since the very beginning. Leah's frame of mind in the weeks leading up to her departure. Friends had described her as calm, even radiant at times, but also detached, almost otherworldly. After her car accident a year earlier, doctors had mentioned she'd likely suffered a concussion and possible mild traumatic brain injury, though there were no long-term diagnoses made. Could her mental state have played a role? Could she have been experiencing a dissociative episode or some delayed psychological response to trauma? But if that were the case, why had she made such careful preparations? Why had she withdrawn cash, prepared a travel pack, left a note suggesting awareness of her actions? Her journey across the country was not haphazard, it had been intentional. She had travelled methodically westward, not skipping around in confusion, not leaving signs of distress or paranoia. The evidence didn't suggest a woman losing control, it suggested a woman following something, maybe even someone. Investigators went back to the mechanic in Bellingham, the man who'd reported being approached by a stranger asking oddly specific questions about abandoned vehicles. He recalled that the man had looked dishevelled, around his 30s, and had seemed very interested in how long a vehicle could sit unnoticed in the forest. When asked if the man could be connected to Leah, he couldn't say, but he remembered something else. The stranger had mentioned a woman. He hadn't said her name, but he implied that she had gone missing, or was gone. The phrasing stuck with him, enough that he reported it to police once the news broke about Leah's case. A sketch artist worked with him to produce a composite image. It was circulated locally, even aired on a few regional news broadcasts, but no one came forward. No one recognised the face, and the man never returned. Cara and Heath considered the possibility that Leah had met this person on the road, somewhere between Oregon and Bellingham. She had been known to strike up conversations with strangers, to trust easily, especially if someone shared her love for literature or travel. What if she had picked up a hitchhiker? What if someone had offered to show her around the Cascades? Someone who knew the area better than she did? And what if that someone had lied? Still, that was speculation. What they needed was proof. In 2006, 6 years after Leah vanished, renewed attention came when a television show featured her case, prompting new calls and tips. Most led nowhere, but one call caught the attention of law enforcement. A woman claimed her ex-boyfriend, who had once lived in the Bellingham area, had spoken about a young woman who had gone missing in the mountains. He had supposedly made a cryptic comment during an argument, something like, "No one ever found that girl, and they won't find you either." She provided a name, but the man denied knowing Leah or having any involvement. Police interviewed him and found nothing to hold him on. He had no record, no solid link to Leah's case. Still, the woman was adamant. Something about what he had said had chilled her. It was enough to keep the case open, enough to convince the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office to retain her file as active. But even that lead fizzled. Over time, Leah's face faded from newscasts. Her name was mentioned less frequently in updates about unsolved cases. In some ways, it was as if the wilderness had won, as if it had swallowed her story along with her presence. But for her family, the absence was never passive. They continued to maintain a website about Leah, updating it with any new tips or public interest. Cara would often speak at missing persons events, using Leah's case as a haunting example of how quickly someone can vanish without a trace, and how difficult it is to find closure without answers. The longer the silence stretched, the more surreal it all became. How could someone simply disappear in the age of information? How could there be no credit card use, no social media footprint, no sightings, no remains? There's a term that missing persons investigators use, voluntary disappearance, describes someone who chooses to leave their life behind, start over, and avoid detection. It happens more often than people think, but the longer you look at Leah Roberts' case, the harder it is to place it in that category. She had dreams, yes, but she had ties, strong ones. She had no clear motive to cut all contact. And she had left behind too much, too suddenly, for it to feel like part of a larger plan. The mountains she had wanted to see, the place Kerouac had once written about with such reverence, had become her final echo, and whether by accident, design, or the intervention of another person, those mountains remained stubbornly silent. In the years that followed Leah's disappearance, the forest that had once symbolized possibilities slowly took on a more sinister identity. For her family, Mount Baker was no longer a distant, majestic peak. It became a haunting monument to the unknown. Each trail, each ravine, each shadowed thicket seemed to withhold answers. And the more time passed, the more the case shifted from urgent investigation to painful preservation, an attempt to hold on to a memory in the face of complete silence. By the mid-2000s, most official searches had ended. There were no new leads, no new evidence, yet Cara and Heath refused to let Leah's name disappear from public consciousness. They continued to speak with journalists, hoping a small thread might unravel the truth. They worked closely with organisations that specialised in missing persons and cold cases, advocating for better interstate communication and data sharing. For them, this was no longer just about Leah. It was about all the others like her, the ones who vanished quietly while the world moved on. What continued to plague investigators, even years later, were the unanswerable inconsistencies. Why, if Leah intended to vanish on her own terms, did she leave behind her life so sloppily? Her Jeep was full of items no rational person would abandon: cash, medicine, personal muddy writings. None of it pointed to someone preparing for a long-term disappearance. And yet, there was no sign of struggle either. No blood, no torn clothing, no panic written into the crash site. The scene was still as eerie as the day it was discovered. A wrecked Jeep with the windows covered in blankets, almost as though someone had lived in it, waited in it. The blankets became a point of focus for private investigators. Their placement, methodical and clean, didn't suggest panic or haste. It felt staged, or at the very least purposeful, as if Leah, or someone, had taken the time to create privacy. But for what? Rest? Hiding? And who hangs blankets after a crash unless they intend to remain inside the vehicle afterward? It wasn't something you did while injured or fleeing. It was something you did when you were waiting for something or someone. The items left behind in the Jeep also raised eyebrows. In particular, Leah's cherished copy of The Dharma Bums by Jack Kerouac lay in the back seat. That book had been her talisman, her compass. To abandon it would be like leaving behind a piece of herself. Alongside it were her guitar, her cat's belongings, and her neatly folded clothes. Again, not chaos, order. The implication wasn't that Leah had rushed off in fear. It was that she, or someone else, had tried to create the appearance of an unfinished story. One of the more baffling elements remained the behaviour of the man who had approached the mechanic in Bellingham. His curiosity about how long a car could remain hidden in the woods, and the fact that he asked just days before Leah's Jeep was discovered, made many believe he was connected. But without a name, a license plate, or any footage, there was nothing to tie him definitively to the case. Still, investigators couldn't ignore the timing. If he had known about the Jeep before it was officially reported, that placed him, or someone he knew, at the scene before anyone else. The theory that Leah had staged the crash herself began to lose credibility over time. There was no indication she had prepared for survival in the wilderness, and no reliable evidence she was suicidal. Her note, though abstract, had been full of optimism and purpose. She had written about feeling alive, about needing to explore. There were no goodbyes, no indications of despair. If anything, she seemed excited, eager to reconnect with the world in a different way. Her sister Cara once described the note not as a farewell, but as a spiritual declaration. Leah had written of synchronicity, of believing the universe had a plan. It sounded more like someone on the brink of discovery, not someone teetering on the edge of oblivion. That tone made her sudden disappearance all the more jarring. If this journey had been her rebirth, why did it end in wreckage? Some began to consider the possibility that Leah had met someone along the way, someone who shared her ideals, or at least pretended to, someone who saw in her vulnerability an opportunity. Cross-country travel often attracts drifters, opportunists, those with nowhere else to go. It wouldn't have been hard for someone to strike up a conversation at a rest stop or a roadside diner. Leah was friendly, trusting. She wasn't naive, but she was open, perhaps too open for the road. An alternate theory surfaced around 2009 from an independent investigator named Christina. She believed Leah may have been followed from Oregon into Washington, targeted either by someone she met briefly or by someone who had become fixated on her. Christina pointed to the disconnection between the final confirmed sightings of Leah, her gas purchase and food stop in Oregon, and the crash site near Bellingham. There was a significant gap in the timeline, with no purchases or calls made during that span. Could someone have been travelling alongside her? Could someone have intercepted her before she ever reached her intended destination? Leah had once written in her journal about wanting to be part of the flow of the world, to embrace randomness. But what if she had trusted that randomness a little too fully? What if she had opened herself up to someone who had no intention of letting her continue on that journey? Her siblings kept returning to one idea. If Leah had simply walked away from the Jeep, there should have been a trail, a scent, something. But multiple cadaver dogs brought into the area years later picked up nothing. No bones were ever discovered, no clothing remnants, no remains. In an area known for rugged terrain and animal activity, that itself was unusual. If she had perished in the forest, at least some evidence should have emerged after 5, 10, 15 years. But there was nothing. That led to a terrifying possibility. What if Leah had never left the area by foot? What if she had been taken? That scenario opened up darker theories: a local abduction, a predator with knowledge of the woods, someone who had helped stage the Jeep to mislead investigators, someone who had driven Leah, or coerced her, to that remote area with purpose. Could it have been a trucker? A loner familiar with the back roads? Someone who knew how long it might take for a vehicle to be discovered on a remote logging road? It wasn't just a convenient spot, it was strategically hidden. The Jeep couldn't be seen from the main road. You had to know where to look. That kind of knowledge didn't come from a tourist or a passerby. It came from someone who lived in or frequented the area. And that brings us back to the man with the question. He had disappeared just as quickly as he had arrived. No name, no further sightings, just the lingering possibility that he had known something, that he had been watching, that Leah had never really been alone on that road. By the 10th anniversary of Leah's disappearance in 2010, her case had become something of a ghost story in Bellingham, shared quietly, respectfully, but never quite aloud. Her name would come up in conversations about strange disappearances, about the dangers of the open road, about the thin line between adventure and vulnerability. And while some believed she had chosen to vanish, others couldn't shake the sense that something had gone terribly wrong, that Leah Roberts, full of hope and purpose, had trusted the road too much. And the road, in return, had given her to the forest. In the heart of every cold case lies a moment, sometimes so quiet you almost miss it, when time seems to stop. Not for the world, not for the headlines or the investigators, but for the people who loved the missing. For Leah Roberts' family, that moment stretched endlessly. Each year they watched as new cases surfaced and were solved, while Leah's faded further into obscurity. They weren't just grieving her absence, they were grieving the lack of resolution, the empty space where truth should have been. By 2011, 11 years had passed, and still nothing. No body, no final message, no conclusive evidence that Leah was alive or dead. The case file had grown thick, but not with answers, with possibilities. Too many. She might have vanished voluntarily, she might have died in the forest, she might have been abducted. Each theory had just enough logic to remain plausible, and just enough contradiction to be maddening. Around this time, Cara Roberts became even more vocal in her search for closure. In interviews, she spoke not just about Leah's case, but about the pain of ambiguous loss, the unique torment that comes from not knowing if a loved one is alive or dead. She described it as living in a constant loop, replaying every memory, analysing every conversation. Could she have missed a warning sign? Was Leah trying to say goodbye without actually saying it? But there had been no real warning. If anything, Leah had seemed more alive than she had in years. In the days before she left, she had baked cookies for friends. She had made a mix CD. She had talked about finding something bigger than herself. That doesn't sound like someone preparing to die. It sounds like someone preparing to live. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case was the reliability of her timeline. Leah had been spotted across several states: Tennessee, Utah, Oregon. Witnesses consistently described her as upbeat, talkative, engaged, not distressed, not evasive. She had spoken to a coffee shop clerk in Brooks, Oregon, with enthusiasm about heading north to Washington, about chasing the spirit of Kerouac. She had even talked about specific places she wanted to visit: Mount Rainier, Bellingham, and possibly Desolation Peak. This wasn't a woman running from her life, this was someone running towards something. But if she had arrived with so much purpose, how had it all gone so wrong? Private investigators kept returning to the Jeep. It remained the most tangible piece of evidence in the case. After years in storage, it had been combed over again and again, fingerprints lifted, fibres collected, mechanical anomalies noted. That snipped wire under the hood still stood out. It wasn't something that could have happened by accident. It had to be intentional, and it suggested a post-crash decision to immobilize the car permanently. Investigators considered whether someone had been with her in the Jeep. The setup inside suggested it. The blankets, the folded pants, the lack of personal effects taken, these details pointed to someone settling in, not someone fleeing a wreck. Could Leah have invited someone into her car? Or worse, could someone have forced their way in? This led to deeper dives into the region's history. Bellingham, while peaceful and remote, had seen its share of violence. There had been a few missing women cases over the years, most unconnected, but unsettling all the same. In particular, law enforcement reviewed cases of missing hitchhikers and transient individuals. One stood out. In the mid-90s, a young woman had vanished near Mount Baker under somewhat similar circumstances. Her car had also been found off a remote road, though her body was eventually recovered months later. Foul play had been suspected, but never proven. It wasn't enough to draw a direct link, but it was enough to remind everyone how easily people disappeared in that landscape, and how easily it could happen again. Around this time, new forensic technologies began to emerge, tools that allowed investigators to analyse old evidence in more precise ways. Carr and Heath petitioned the Sheriff's Department to re-examine the prints found in Leah's Jeep. In 2013, those prints were run through an expanded national database using updated algorithms. There was still no match. Whoever had touched that vehicle wasn't in any criminal system. Still, it was one of the few pieces of hard evidence that remained. A print, a physical trace, a sign that someone else had been there. Meanwhile, internet sleuths and amateur investigators had begun to take an interest in the case. Online forums like Web Sleuths hosted long, sprawling threads about Leah's disappearance. Theories were dissected with painstaking attention. Some users focused on the timeline gaps between Oregon and Bellingham. Others dove into psychological profiles suggesting Leah may have been experiencing a manic episode or dissociative break. A few went darker, theorizing she had been abducted and her disappearance covered up. One user, posting anonymously, claimed to have seen Leah at a rest stop near Tacoma days before her Jeep was found. The woman had seemed dazed, confused, and was speaking to a man described as older, with long hair and a beard. The man reportedly had his hand on her shoulder in a way that made the poster uncomfortable. But by the time she decided to act, they had driven off. The tip was investigated, but like so many before it, led nowhere. No surveillance footage existed. No additional witnesses came forward. And the user never posted again. Yet the detail stuck with Kara. Could Leah have been travelling with someone by the time she reached Washington? Not out of fear, but out of trust. Had she met a kindred spirit on the road who slowly became something more dangerous? It wasn't far-fetched. The road is full of people searching, some for meaning, others for prey. The same openness that made Leah beloved among her friends could have made her a target. She was physically vulnerable from her past injuries, emotionally raw from the loss of her parents, and spiritually seeking. That kind of openness, if met by the wrong kind of person, could turn tragic. In 2015, 15 years after her disappearance, Leah's story was picked up by a national true crime podcast. The renewed media attention generated a short-lived resurgence of tips, most anonymous, most unverifiable. One stood out. A woman in British Columbia claimed to have spoken to someone at a remote hostel who said he had once travelled with a girl named Leah from North Carolina who disappeared in the woods. He had spoken of her fondly but vaguely. When pressed for details, he claimed not to remember her last name. Police attempted to identify the man, but the hostel's guest records were incomplete. Another potential lead lost to time. Still, this fragment, like so many others, reinforced the same troubling idea. Leah may not have been alone on that final stretch of road. And if she had been with someone, that person had never come forward. That silence spoke volumes. And so her case remained, formless, floating between theories weighed down by too many unknowns. The image of the crumpled Jeep, blanketed windows drawn like curtains, remained burned into the minds of those who followed her story. It wasn't just a crash site, it was a mausoleum of unanswered questions. In a way, Leah had become the very thing she admired in Kerouac's writing, an open-ended sentence, a trail that disappears into the trees, a mystery left for others to decipher. And though she had always believed in the randomness of life, in the poetry of wandering, the randomness of her disappearance felt more cruel than beautiful. Still, her family refused to believe she had vanished into nothing. There had to be something more, some overlooked piece, some hidden truth that might still rise to the surface, if only someone was still looking. In the solitude of cold cases, there's a different kind of grief, one that never climaxes, never resolves, just lingers. As the years passed into decades, Leah Roberts became a symbol of that grief, not just to her family, but to the ever-growing community of people who followed her story. Her case was the kind that echoed, subtle, sorrowful, unfinished. People remembered her not just because she vanished, but because of how she vanished, with purpose, with poetry, with mystery. By 2020, it'd been 20 years since her disappearance, 2 full decades. The world had changed, but the canyon where her Jeep was found remained the same, overgrown, quiet, indifferent. The road that led there was even more secluded now, weathered by time and disuse, a place frozen at the edge of memory. Leah's siblings had long accepted the likelihood that their sister was gone, but they had never accepted the silence. In interviews, Cara often spoke about the weight of not knowing. "You don't get to mourn someone who's missing," she once said. "You mourn the hole they left, and then you mourn it again every morning when they're still not back." She and Heath had aged into the strange role of being keepers of a story that had no ending. They had children of their own now, children who only knew their Aunt Leah through photographs and quiet conversations, but her presence, they said, had never left their lives. They still visited the Pacific Northwest every few years, still walked the woods near Canyon Creek Road, still left flowers, still asked questions. Some questions they had stopped hoping would be answered, others still clung tightly to them. One of those lingering questions resurfaced in 2021 when a former Whatcom County Sheriff's detective came out of retirement and gave an interview on a true crime podcast. He had worked Leah's case in its early days and had remained quietly haunted by it ever since. He didn't offer bombshell revelations, but he did confirm something the family had long suspected. Law enforcement had always believed someone else had been in that Jeep. He spoke cautiously but pointedly. There were elements of that crash that didn't sit right, he said. The way the vehicle was found, someone went to lengths to make it look accidental, but it felt constructed. That's not something you do if you're trying to get away. That's something you do if you want to buy time, if you want people to think she's gone. He also shared that the department had received anonymous letters in the early 2000s, 2 of them, short, typed, unsigned. They didn't contain threats, and they didn't mention Leah by name, but they spoke of the girl who was looking for meaning and the road that led to the wrong mountain. He didn't elaborate further, and the letters had never been authenticated. But they were enough to reignite speculation that someone, somewhere, knew more than they ever revealed. It was just another piece in a puzzle with too many edges and no center. That same year, a civilian hiker discovered bones in a remote area several miles from where Leah's vehicle had been found. The remains were partially buried and degraded by time. For a moment, everyone who remembered Leah braced themselves. Could this be her? But within days, the medical examiner announced the bones were male. Not Leah, not a new lead, just another false spark in a long darkness. Still, it highlighted the brutal truth of the terrain. The North Cascades are vast, and the woods don't give up secrets easily. There are places out there where no foot has stepped in decades, ravines so deep and narrow that a body could lie hidden forever. If Leah had wandered into one of those, if she had died of exposure or injury, it was entirely possible she would never be found. But even that theory had its flaws. Where were her belongings, her jacket, her boots, her backpack? None of it was missing from the Jeep. If she had gone into the woods, she had done so completely unprepared. Or she hadn't gone in at all. The idea that someone else had driven the Jeep, staged the crash and vanished, gained traction again. In a Reddit thread dedicated to cold cases, amateur sleuths pored over the details, remapping Leah's last known movements, hypothesizing about the person who'd been described to the mechanic in Bellingham. One user compiled a list of known drifters and fugitives active in the region at the time. Another tracked reports of stolen vehicles and fraudulent identities within a 200-mile radius of the crash. But as always, the theories outpaced the evidence. There were no fingerprints to match, no DNA hits, no confirmed sightings, just a haunting pattern of possibility. Kara continued her work with missing persons organisations, advocating for better technology and cross-agency communication. Leah's case had shown how easily someone could slip between jurisdictions, how vulnerable people were once they left the traceable boundaries of home. She urged families to push for more than just missing person flyers, to demand databases be updated, cold cases re-examined, leads followed with discipline even years later. She also held on to Leah's journals, the ones found in her room after she disappeared. They were full of fragments, quotes, lyrics, thoughts about mortality and freedom. Some entries were melancholy, but most were full of awe. She had written often about the road as a living thing, about the beauty in the unknown. There was one entry that Kara came back to often. Maybe we're not meant to find all the answers. Maybe we're just meant to keep moving, to keep asking. That's enough. It was classic Leah, philosophical, untethered, always moving. But to Kara, it also sounded like someone who expected to come back, who expected there to be time, who hadn't intended for the journey to be her last. In the end, that's what haunts people the most about Leah's disappearance. Not just that she vanished, but that her story was so full of life before she did. She wasn't spiraling, she wasn't lost, she was searching. And somewhere along the way, something or someone stopped her. The forest never gave up her body. The world never gave up her name, but the silence around her has never been peaceful. It's electric, restless, like something just on the edge of being known. And maybe that's what Leah felt when she left North Carolina. That hum, that call to something beyond. Maybe she believed the road could answer her questions. Maybe, in the end, the road only asked its own. Sometimes, when a person disappears, they leave behind more than just belongings. They leave behind a narrative gap, something unresolvable. Leah Roberts' case is that kind of gap. An unfinished line in a journal. A pause between two thoughts. For those who loved her, it wasn't just about finding her. It was about understanding the why that hung over everything she left behind. By the mid-2020s, Leah's story had become a quiet legacy. She was no longer in headlines, but she was still whispered about in online forums, still present in the minds of those who followed unsolved disappearances. Her face, framed with that soft, thoughtful smile, still appeared on missing persons posters and anniversary articles. But it was harder now. The photos were dated. Her story existed in a different time, before smartphones, before social media could map a person's every movement. And yet because of that, Leah's disappearance felt more haunting, more cinematic, like she'd walked into the Pacific Northwest and been absorbed by the trees. In 2023, an independent filmmaker reached out to Kara and Heath about making a documentary on Leah's case. At first, they hesitated. They'd been through media cycles before, and they knew how often their sister's name was used as a plot device, a mystery for strangers to speculate on. But something about this filmmaker was different. She didn't want to sensationalize Leah's disappearance. She wanted to tell Leah's story as a person, a sister, a dreamer. The project went ahead, and for the first time in years, Kara sat down in front of a camera and read aloud from Leah's journals. The pages had yellowed with time, but the words still sang. One entry in particular stayed with her. I keep thinking about all the places I haven't seen yet. Not just the geography, the feeling of places, how the air smells, how people talk when they're relaxed. I want to touch the texture of the world before I settle into anything, before the world tells me to be still. It was written just 2 weeks before Leah left North Carolina. She'd already begun planning, tracing her route with highlighters and notes. She wasn't fleeing, she was reaching. The documentary brought renewed attention to the case. New tips came in, none of them groundbreaking, but enough to reopen conversations. A woman in her late 40s called in from Eastern Washington, saying she remembered meeting a young traveller named Leah at a roadside campsite in 2000. They'd only spoken for an hour, but she remembered Leah vividly. She was magnetic, the woman said. Smart, but sad too, like she'd seen something the rest of us hadn't. But even this memory, however clear, came with no actionable detail. She couldn't remember the exact location. She couldn't remember the car Leah was driving. It was just a shadow of a moment, fleeting and gentle and lost to time. Still, it meant something. Leah hadn't disappeared in one instant. Her story had rippled outward, touching people on her way west. And with each remembered conversation, each blurry memory, her presence re-emerged, not in body but in essence. In Whatcom County, the sheriff's office digitized her case file, releasing portions to the public under FOA requests. Thousands of pages of reports, interviews, photographs. Amateur sleuths began combing through them, comparing inconsistencies, tracking every detail. They pointed out a few things law enforcement had never followed up on. Odd cars parked near the crash site in the days after the Jeep was discovered, an unconfirmed sighting of Leah at a mountain gear shop in Olympia, and that persistent, unsettling figure, the man who spoke to the mechanic. That man, now referred to online simply as the Stranger, had become a symbol in Leah's case. He was mentioned in blogs, forums and documentaries. Artists rendered sketches based on witness descriptions. One armchair investigator even used AI to generate composite images, hoping facial recognition software might find a match in public databases. Nothing ever came of it. But the idea of him, that someone out there might know exactly what happened, was a weight no one could shake. There's a term in missing persons investigations, last known point. It's the place where a person was last verifiably seen. For Leah, that point had always been hazy. Was it the gas station in Brooks, Oregon? The possible diner in Bellingham? Or was it the Jeep itself, the silent tomb that held no body? What if her last known point wasn't a place at all but a person? Someone who saw her last, someone who made sure she wasn't seen again. The filmmaker followed this line in her documentary, interviewing wilderness experts, criminal profilers, even psychologists. One profiler suggested Leah might have been coerced. People assume danger always comes in the form of violence, she said, but sometimes it comes softly, through influence, through control, and one might have made her believe they shared her vision, and slowly turned it inside out. The documentary didn't solve Leah's case, but it reframed it. It reminded people that Leah wasn't just a missing person, she was a person with dreams and history and depth, and in doing so it drew in new eyes, among them a former intelligence analyst who had worked in counter-surveillance. She watched the documentary and became obsessed with the case. Quietly, without fanfare, she began cross-referencing timelines, running analytics on known offenders, checking travel data from that era. She reached out to Kara privately. They spoke for hours. Her conclusion wasn't definitive, but it was compelling. She believed Leah had met someone while traveling, possibly in Oregon. This person may have already had a history of controlling behavior or even prior criminal behavior that had gone under the radar. She theorized that the Jeep was crashed on purpose, not to kill Leah, but to sever her from the world. And then, under threat, persuasion, or psychological control, Leah was taken somewhere remote, somewhere she either couldn't or wasn't allowed to return from. It was a chilling idea, not definitive, not provable, but disturbingly plausible. Could Leah have been alive for days or even weeks after her car was found? Could someone have kept her hidden, or worse, taken her across the border into a life of silence? There were no clear answers, no arrests, no new evidence, but the possibility breathed new life into the search. Leah's name surfaced again in law enforcement circles. Cold case teams re-examined her file. Forensic genealogists offered their services, hoping to trace familial DNA from the Jeep's unidentified fingerprints. And Kara, older now, a mother with streaks of grey in her hair, found herself feeling something she hadn't dared feel in years. Hope. Not the naive kind, not the hope of rescue or reunion, but the hope that maybe, just maybe, someone who knew something was still out there, and that enough people still cared to keep asking. Leah's story, after all, had never truly gone cold, it had merely gone quiet. And in that quiet, something still pulsed. A name, a question, a promise left unfinished. The years wore on like erosion, slow, imperceptible but relentless. By 2025, Leah Roberts' disappearance was 25 years old. A quarter of a century. An entire generation had grown up since her Jeep was found abandoned and silent beneath the looming trees of Mount Baker. And yet, despite the time, despite the quiet, Leah's case had never really faded. It had simply changed shape, becoming something between legend and ache, something half-remembered and half-studied, an echo moving through time. Cara and Heath had changed too. Their energy was quieter now. Their grief no longer spilled outward. It had folded in on itself, like a book closed but never shelved. They still spoke of Leah with love, but less often with urgency. Not because they'd given up, but because they'd found something resembling peace in the unknowing. A fragile peace, the kind you carry gently so it doesn't break. And yet the story refused to end. That year, a man in his 60s walked into a sheriff's substation near Bellingham with a strange claim. He had seen a woman, years ago, on a trail north of Canyon Creek Road. She had looked dazed, barefoot, and appeared to be injured. He hadn't told anyone at the time, assuming she was a lost hiker who had found her way back. But after recently watching a documentary on missing persons, he saw Leah's photo and felt a jolt of recognition. He didn't remember the exact year, only that it was early 2000s. The woman, possibly Leah, had said almost nothing, just a few words. "I'm all right." He never forgot her face, but at the time it hadn't felt significant. Now it haunted him. Investigators took the statement, but with so much time passed, there was little they could do. No photos, no coordinates, no follow-up possible. Another potential sighting swallowed by time. Still, it sparked something. Cold case detectives re-examined the topographical data around the Jeep's crash site. The area had been searched extensively in 2000, and again years later, but newer imaging tools allowed for a more detailed terrain analysis. Using LiDAR and infrared satellite scans, they identified a series of deep sinkholes and collapses, geological features that may have opened over time or been overlooked during earlier searches. These weren't just ravines, they were vertical traps, some hidden beneath dense undergrowth. One in particular, just under a half-mile from the crash site, drew attention. It had no trail access, no human footprints recorded nearby, and it had never been scanned beneath the surface. A team was dispatched. Ground-penetrating radar was used, but thick layers of rock and debris made visibility difficult. They couldn't determine if anything or anyone was at the bottom. Still, it became the most concrete possibility in years. If Leah had walked from the Jeep disoriented, injured, or simply lost, and stumbled into this pit, her body might never have been found. And even now, it might lie beneath layers of moss and silence. It wasn't a hopeful theory, but it was real, and it gave the Roberts family something they hadn't had in years, a reason. But the theory didn't sit easily with everyone. Some felt it was too neat, too tidy, too late. Online, debate rekindled. Some still believed Leah had been the victim of foul play. The mysterious man who had inquired about the Jeep before it was found, how had he known? And why had he never come forward? Others leaned into the psychological theories. Was it possible Leah had dissociated, or entered a fugue state and chosen a life beyond the grid? A retired FBI agent who had followed Leah's case from a distance for years published a long-form essay proposing something more layered, that Leah may have initially left home to disappear, not permanently, but for a spiritual break from her life, a sabbatical from pain. And during that vulnerable window, she met someone who saw her vulnerability and exploited it. The essay explored the psychology of trauma survivors, how the death of both parents in such rapid succession could create a profound rupture in one's sense of reality. Leah, the agent argued, wasn't unstable. She was unmoored. And people who are unmoored tend to seek anchors, even dangerous ones. What if that anchor was a person? What if Leah had met someone who offered the illusion of purpose only to betray it? The theory resonated deeply with some. It explained the staged crash site, the lack of panic in her belongings, the eerie orderliness of the scene. It explained the missing time in her travelogue, and it explained the one thing no one had ever been able to answer. Why would someone abandon such a carefully constructed life so completely, so abruptly, without a single word of goodbye? Unless they weren't alone. Unless they were convinced or coerced into staying silent. In the wake of the essay, Leah's case once again trended across true crime forums and social media. The renewed interest led to a fresh wave of podcast episodes, blog posts, and even a fictionalized short story inspired by her journey. But none of it changed the outcome. There was still no Leah, no conclusive evidence, just echoes. One day, Cara received a letter in the mail, no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper, yellowed and thin, typed like the anonymous letters received by police decades earlier. It read only this: "She looked at the mountain like it was speaking to her. I think maybe it was." Kara held the note in her hands for a long time. It wasn't threatening, it wasn't helpful, but it stirred something primal, the sense that someone, somewhere, had been with her sister in those final days, watching, maybe even listening. She handed the letter to police, who had it analysed. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing. Still, it brought back everything: the jeep in the ravine, the empty cash in the wallet, the guitar, the blanket-covered windows. A life interrupted, a mystery preserved. In the end, Leah Roberts' story doesn't close like a novel. It doesn't offer the luxury of certainty. It floats like mist on a forest trail, impossible to hold, impossible to forget. Her family has stopped asking for a happy ending. What they want is smaller now. A bone, a thread, a name. Anything to pin down the truth, to tether the story, to give Leah's journey, however it ended, a resting place. Until then, she remains what she has been for so long: an unanswered question in the woods, a spark of spirit on the road, a woman who went searching for something greater and vanished without a trace. And though the world may forget the details, those who remember Leah know this: she wasn't lost because she broke. She was lost because she believed. In beauty, in meaning, in the idea that the world still had secrets worth finding. Maybe she found one, and maybe one day so will we. Years melted away, and with them the sharp edges of grief dulled, but never disappeared. Leah Roberts' story became less about a missing person and more about the quiet persistence of hope in the face of silence. For those who loved her, the mystery wasn't just a riddle to solve. It was a shadow they lived alongside, a space in their lives that no amount of time could fill. Her disappearance left a ripple effect on the culture of missing persons investigations in the Pacific Northwest. Her case, emblematic of the challenges law enforcement faced in remote wilderness searches and interstate coordination, spurred advocacy for better protocols. Technology had improved since 2000, but it remained a double-edged sword. While it allowed for better tracking and data analysis, it also revealed how many people slipped through the cracks every year. In memorials and small gatherings, Leah's story was told quietly, sometimes in tears, sometimes in laughter. Friends recalled her free spirit, her fierce curiosity, her moments of tenderness. She was remembered as a woman alive with questions, not a victim of circumstance. The Roberts family, in their private moments, kept her memory alive with an intimate ritual. Each year, on July 8th, the day Leah was last seen, they released lanterns into the night sky near the edge of the woods. The glowing orbs floated upward, fragile yet resolute, a visual metaphor for the sister, daughter, and friend who had once stepped into the world seeking something bigger than herself. Sometimes, when the night was still and the air crisp, they swore they could hear the faintest whisper of her voice in the wind, a murmur calling from the trees, urging them to keep looking, to keep asking, to never let the story end. Leah Roberts vanished quietly, but her story refuses to be silenced. It lives on in the places she travelled, in the people who loved her, and in every whispered hope that someday, somehow, the mystery will unfold. And until that day comes, the road she once travelled remain waiting, patient and unyielding, holding their secrets close, inviting those who dare to follow the faintest trace left behind.